There are moments in life when your spirit begins to whisper truths your mind is not ready to accept. Moments when you feel something shifting inside you, quietly at first, but steadily, persistently, as if God Himself is trying to get your attention. You feel it in conversations that once felt normal, but now leave you empty. You feel it when you walk away from certain relatives, and the atmosphere around you feels lighter, almost like a weight has been lifted off your chest. You feel it when the tone of someone's words wounds you in ways you can no longer ignore. You feel it in the guilt that rises when you try to assert yourself. You feel it in the tension between who you used to be and who God is calling you to become. And deep down, even if you don't have the language for it yet, you know this God is warning you. Not with thunder, not with fire, not with loud signs, but with subtle shifts in your spirit that you can't dismiss anymore. You see, God rarely begins by shouting. He begins with nudges, those gentle, holy disruptions that make you notice what you once tolerated. And nowhere is this shift more painful, more confusing, and more complex than when it happens with family. Because family is where you learned your first definitions, your first definition of love, your first definition of loyalty, your first definition of respect, your first definition of safety, your first definition of identity. And when God begins to expose toxicity within the people who shaped your earliest understanding of relationships, it shakes you at the deepest level. Because it doesn't just challenge your habits, it challenges your history, your memories, your sense of this is normal, your sense of this is home, your sense of this is how family works. But the truth is, this God cannot heal what you pretend is healthy. He cannot free what you keep excusing. He cannot transform what you refuse to bring into the light. And becoming the person God created you to be requires a painful, honest look at the places, patterns, and people who have influenced you, family included. For years, you may have shrugged off the comments, the manipulation, the guilt-tripping, the emotional pressure, the subtle disrespect, the way your boundaries were treated as optional. You tolerated the way someone dismissed your feelings. You normalized the way someone mocked your growth. You overlooked the heavy atmosphere that always followed a certain person. You ignored the anxiety that rose in you before a family gathering. You silenced your discomfort every time a relative minimized your pain or exaggerated your flaws or made you question your worth. You told yourself, "They're family. I should just swallow it. Maybe I'm overreacting. It's better to keep the peace. It's not that serious. This is just how they are. I don't want to cause problems. I don't want to be ungrateful." But your spirit knew the truth long before your mind had the courage to admit it. This relationship is hurting you. And here's the beautiful, painful, holy truth. When God begins to elevate you, He also begins to expose everything that cannot go with you. Families often carry generations of unhealed wounds, patterns nobody questioned, behaviors that were passed down like tradition, anger disguised as leadership, control disguised as concern, manipulation disguised as affection, guilt disguised as love, silence disguised as peace. And because you grew up within this environment, you assumed it was normal, until God awakened you. And here is the sign that God is waking you up. What you once tolerated now feels unbearable. What you once ignored now feels harmful. What you once thought was just their personality now feels spiritually heavy. What you once excused now feels like violation. What you once endured now feels like self-betrayal. This is not you becoming rebellious. This is not you becoming ungrateful. This is not you becoming distant. This is not you acting different. This is you becoming whole. Healing changes how you interpret behavior. Wholeness changes your appetite. Growth exposes what wounds kept you blind to. Maturity reveals the weight of emotional and spiritual environments you grew up in. You begin to see patterns you were too young to understand. You begin to connect dots no one else ever had the courage to face. You begin to understand why certain people drain you, why certain conversations leave you spiraling, why certain relatives always trigger you, why certain dynamics make you feel like a child again instead of the adult you actually are. Your body remembers what your mind forgot. Your spirit recognizes what your logic excuses. And God shines light where darkness has lived unchallenged for years. You start noticing how often someone uses guilt to control you, how often someone invalidates your feelings, how often someone uses family loyalty as a weapon, how often someone belittles your accomplishments, how often someone rewrites history to protect their ego, how often someone demands your silence for the sake of peace. How often someone takes advantage of your compassion. You see the subtle power games. You see the emotional manipulation. You see the favoritism, the double standards, the competition, the passive-aggressive comments, the backhanded jokes, the dismissive reactions whenever you express your needs. And God whispers, "Do you see now I've been trying to show you?" The hardest thing in the world is realizing the people you love can be the same people who wound you the deepest. And that loving them does not mean surrendering yourself. God never asked you to shrink so others remain comfortable. He never asked you to betray your own soul to preserve a false peace. He never asked you to abandon your emotional safety for the sake of tradition. Love does not mean access. Forgiveness does not mean tolerance. Family does not mean entitlement. Honor does not mean self-destruction. Sometimes the person your heart wants to protect is the same person your spirit needs distance from. Because choosing yourself is not selfish. It is stewardship. Stewardship of your mind. Stewardship of your spirit. Stewardship of your emotional health. Stewardship of your destiny. And this is the revelation many never receive. The enemy often uses familiar faces to plant unfamiliar pain. He knows you would never allow a stranger to speak to you the way certain relatives do. You would never tolerate emotional abuse from someone outside your house. You would never overlook manipulation from someone without your last name. So he hides his attacks behind the word family, hoping you won't recognize the harm. But God does not protect dysfunction. He exposes it, interrupts it, and calls you out of it. That is why your spirit felt uneasy, why certain gatherings feel spiritually suffocating, why certain phone calls feel draining, why certain relationships deplete your joy, why certain relatives don't celebrate your progress but quietly resent it. They don't resent your success. They resent your evolution. Because the moment you evolve, their control loses power. You outgrew the version of you they could manipulate. You healed beyond the identity they assigned you. You matured past the narratives they used to keep you small. And now God is saying, I am calling you out of emotional patterns disguised as family loyalty. He is calling you out of cycles you were born into. He is calling you out of inherited pain. He is calling you out of generational dysfunction. He is calling you out of expectations that suffocate your identity. He is calling you out of being the emotional caretaker for everyone except yourself. Because you cannot carry the weight of everyone's brokenness and still walk into your destiny whole. You cannot be the family's emotional dumping ground and still be the person God is shaping you into. You cannot keep rescuing people who refuse to rescue themselves. You cannot keep losing yourself in environments that do not value you. And the moment you begin to listen to God's warning, everything shifts. Your boundaries strengthen. Your voice returns. Your peace becomes a priority. Your discernment sharpens. Your self-respect increases. Your emotional clarity grows. Your identity stabilizes. You stop explaining your choices. You stop apologizing for protecting your heart. You stop shrinking so others feel tall. You stop giving people access they have not earned. You stop allowing guilt to lead your decisions. And for the first time, you begin to feel like you. Not the version shaped by trauma. Not the version shaped by family expectations. Not the version shaped by survival. Not the version shaped by fear of rejection. But the version shaped by God healing truth, purpose, and maturity. This is the beginning of freedom, the beginning of clarity, the beginning of transformation. There comes a season usually unexpected, usually uncomfortable, when God begins to shine a brighter light on the relationships you've always assumed were normal. He doesn't do it to embarrass anyone. He doesn't do it to make you bitter. He does it because there is a version of you He's raising, and that version cannot survive in the same emotional environment that shaped your wounds. Part of God maturing you is God revealing the truth you were never allowed to see. And nowhere is that revelation more disruptive, more painful, yet more liberating than when it concerns family. Because family toxicity doesn't look like the toxicity you find anywhere else. It's quiet, it's disguised, it's generational. It wraps itself in familiar voices, familiar stories, familiar expectations. It hides behind tradition, behind obligation, behind "this is just our culture." It blends into your childhood memories until you internalize it as truth. So when God starts exposing it, it doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels like betrayal. It feels like guilt. It feels like fear. It feels like you are abandoning people who never hesitated to abandon your emotional needs. But you're not abandoning them. You're abandoning the lies that kept you tied to pain. And God will always unsettle you when you start confusing survival with love. Let's go deeper. There are certain forms of family toxicity so subtle that you only recognize them once you start healing. Healing becomes the lens through which truth becomes visible. For example, a relative who constantly jokes about your weaknesses but never affirms your strengths. A family member who always positions themselves as the victim even when they're the ones causing harm. Someone who keeps score every favor, every sacrifice, every moment they helped you only to weaponize it later. Someone who demands access to your life but refuses to give you respect. Someone who gets angry when you make independent decisions. Someone whose emotions you're always responsible for, even at the cost of your own. Someone who uses spirituality to manipulate you. If you were a good daughter/son, you would. Someone who punishes you with silence the moment you show a boundary. Someone who drains your energy simply by being in the same room. Someone whose presence makes you anxious even when nothing is happening. These aren't personality quirks. These are patterns. Patterns that shape your self-esteem. Patterns that shape how you love. Patterns that shape how you trust. Patterns that shape what you tolerate. Patterns so old that they feel like home, even though they've been hurting you your whole life. Where there is a pattern of emotional confusion, there is toxicity. Where there is a pattern of guilt without reason, there is manipulation. Where there is a pattern of walking on eggshells, there is control. Where there is a pattern of unpredictable affection, there is emotional instability. Where there is a pattern of feeling not enough, there is psychological damage. And when God wants to heal you, He reveals not only the wounds you carry, but the hands that created them. This is why spiritual awakening and emotional healing are deeply connected. Because the moment God shows you truth, you cannot unsee it. You cannot unfeel it. You cannot pretend you don't know. You cannot return to blindness without betraying yourself. One of the clearest warnings from God is the loss of peace around certain people. When God wants to protect you, He removes your peace where your spirit is in danger. Pay attention to that. Peace is the voice of God inside you. Fear is the echo of past wounds. Guilt is the language of manipulation. But peace is the compass of your destiny. If every time you talk to a certain relative, your stomach tightens, if every time you share good news, they downplay it, if every time you assert a boundary, they explode or shut down, if every time you succeed, they suddenly need you again, if every time you distance yourself, they stage emotional emergencies, if every time you say no, you feel punished, that is not love. That is control. That is dysfunction. That is emotional conditioning. And God is warning you because He knows the cost of staying loyal to people who are unhealed. Unhealed people can love you and still destroy you without ever realizing it. Some family members love you deeper, but love you incorrectly. Some love you sincerely, but hurt you consistently. Some love you in ways they were taught, not in ways that are healthy. Some love you in forms that feed insecurity, not identity. Love without healing becomes harm. And God sees the harm long before you do. This is why He disrupts your comfort. This is why He starts convicting your heart. This is why He cuts the emotional rope connecting you to certain people. This is why conversations suddenly feel heavier. This is why arguments erupt out of nowhere. This is why emotional distance appears without explanation. This is why your spirit no longer tolerates the dysfunction you grew up with. Because God is transitioning you from inherited pain to intentional healing. And here's where many people become confused. You can love someone deeply and still need distance from them. Distance does not mean dishonor. Distance does not mean bitterness. Distance does not mean rebellion. Distance does not mean disrespect. Distance means health. Distance means clarity. Distance means responsibility. Distance means protection. Distance means obedience to God's voice within you. Sometimes God says, love them, but from afar. Honor them, but don't let them control you. Help them, but don't carry what belongs to them. Forgive them, but don't give them the same access. Care for them, but guard your heart. Because the same people who raised you can still raise emotional chaos inside you. Healing requires space. Identity requires space. Purpose requires space. Clarity requires space. You cannot hear God clearly while listening to the voices He is trying to free you from. And family toxicity is unique because of the emotional pressure attached to it. You feel obligated to explain. You feel obligated to stay. You feel obligated to fix. You feel obligated to carry their pain. But let me tell you something with complete clarity. You are not responsible for healing wounds someone refuses to confront. You are not responsible for filling emotional voids someone created. You are not responsible for being the emotional parent to your own parents. You are not responsible for being the therapist in your family. You are not responsible for sacrificing your peace so someone else avoids accountability. You are not responsible for being the glue that holds dysfunction together. God never assigned you to fix what generations before you broke. Your responsibility is your healing, your destiny, your growth, your calling. And when you prioritize those things, you begin to recognize the truth God tried to show you for years. Some people love you, but they cannot go where you're going. Some people care for you, but they cannot walk at the level God is calling you to. Some people support you emotionally until your growth challenges their comfort. Some people celebrate you as long as your success doesn't outshine their insecurity. And when God begins elevating you, the relational shaking begins. People who used to feel safe now feel unpredictable. People who used to confide in you now compete with you. People who used to depend on you now resent your independence. People who used to calm you now confuse you. People who used to pour into you now only drain you. This is spiritual shaking. It's not punishment, it's preparation. God is preparing you for a healthier emotional environment. God is preparing you for healthier boundaries. God is preparing you for healthier connections. God is preparing you for healthier forms of love. God is preparing you for a life where your peace is not negotiable. And as God elevates you, He exposes who is harming you, not to shame them, but to free you. He frees you from the guilt of saying no. He frees you from the pressure to be the peacemaker in a war you never started. He frees you from carrying emotions that don't belong to you. He frees you from the lies your childhood taught you. He frees you from the belief that tolerating pain is holy. He frees you from the fear that protecting yourself is disrespect. This is why He keeps warning you. Not because He wants you to cut everyone off, but because He wants you to stop cutting yourself open just to keep people close. He wants you to love without losing yourself. He wants you to forgive without becoming someone's emotional doormat.
He wants you to serve without sacrificing your identity. He wants you to connect without compromising your peace. He wants you to be compassionate without being consumed. And the moment you begin listening to these warnings, something huge happens. Your identity begins to shift. Your self-worth begins to solidify. Your internal voice becomes louder than the voices around you. Your emotional boundaries strengthen. Your discernment gets sharper. Your spirit becomes sensitive to what once felt normal. You start recognizing manipulation instantly. You start noticing disrespect without needing a second opinion. You start seeing selfishness behind concern. You start identifying control hidden behind love. You start understanding the emotional patterns that once enslaved you. You awaken. You rise. You grow. And God whispers, "This is what freedom feels like." There comes a point in every healing journey when God not only exposes the pain, but exposes the mechanisms behind that pain. Because it's one thing to know someone hurt you. It's another to finally understand how they hurt you, why it kept happening, and why your spirit could feel the damage long before your mind had words for it. Part of God maturing you is giving you language for what your soul has silently endured for years. Family toxicity is not random. It is patterned. It repeats. It replays. It resurfaces in cycles. And every cycle has a spiritual and psychological structure behind it. The problem is that most people grow up so accustomed to the dynamics of their family that they don't realize the dysfunction has become a blueprint for how they interpret love, a blueprint for how they handle conflict, a blueprint for how they trust others, a blueprint for what they accept and what they avoid, a blueprint for who they allow into their emotional space. And until God interrupts that blueprint, you unknowingly repeat it in friendships, in romantic relationships, in your self-talk, in your spiritual life, in your expectations, in how you let people treat you. This is why God begins by revealing what feels normal but has never been healthy. Let's take this deeper. There are certain toxic behaviors that become so embedded into a family culture that you don't see them as toxic. You see them as just how we operate. But the moment healing enters your life, the moment God starts reshaping your identity, the moment your spirit awakens, you start recognizing the pattern for what it truly is. And that recognition is painful because it dismantles illusions you've held onto your whole life. For example, one of the most damaging forms of family toxicity is emotional invalidation. When someone dismisses your feelings with ridicule, silence, or spiritual language. You say you're hurt, and they say, "Stop being dramatic." You say something bothered you, and they say, "You're too sensitive." You express a need, and they turn it into an attack. You set a boundary, and they accuse you of rebellion. Your feelings are never acknowledged. They are minimized, mocked, or punished. This is not love. This is emotional conditioning. Conditioning that teaches you your emotions don't matter. Conditioning that shapes you into silence. Conditioning that trains you to second-guess your intuition. Conditioning that makes you seek approval instead of authenticity. Conditioning that replaces your voice with fear. And here's the dangerous part. When you grow up in emotional invalidation, you learn to invalidate yourself.
You apologize even when you're right. You stay quiet even when you're hurting. You over-explain yourself to avoid conflict. You tolerate disrespect because you were raised to believe your discomfort isn't important. You normalize red flags because you learned to survive without emotional safety. That's why family toxicity is spiritual. It shapes the beliefs that shape your decisions. But emotional invalidation is only the beginning. A deeper, darker dynamic is guilt manipulation, especially inside family systems that rely on emotional dependence. Guilt manipulation sounds like, I guess, you don't care anymore. After everything I've done for you, you've changed. You think you're better now, so now you're too good for us. I guess family means nothing to you. You're abandoning us. You're the problem. Guilt is the weapon of someone who cannot control you any other way. When they lose power over your choices, they attack your conscience. They don't need to be right. They just need you to feel wrong. And here is the subtle trap. When guilt comes from a family member, it feels like moral obligation. It feels like emotional debt. It feels like you owe them something. It feels like love must look like sacrifice, even when that sacrifice is killing your peace. But guilt is not love. Guilt is control wearing the mask of love. And control is one of the clearest signs of family toxicity, especially when it's hidden inside concern. Control says, you need to do what I expect. You need to act the way I want. You need to follow our rules even if they break your spirit. You need to live the version of life we approve of. Control isn't always loud. Sometimes it's calm, quiet, and persistent. It shows up in disapproving glances, in subtle comments, in passive-aggressive remarks, in emotional sanctions disguised as discipline, in refusing to respect your adulthood, in treating you like a child long after you've grown, in rewriting reality to maintain their authority. But perhaps the most damaging form of control is gaslighting, when someone manipulates your perception until you question your own memory reality or emotional clarity. Gaslighting looks like, that never happened. You're imagining things. You always exaggerate. You're being emotional. You misunderstood me. You're too sensitive. You are remembering it wrong. Gaslighting teaches you not to trust yourself, not to trust your intuition, not to trust your memory, not to trust your discernment, not to trust the truth staring you in the face. It creates internal chaos. It makes you dependent on their version of events. It keeps you from confronting the truth because you're afraid you might be wrong, even when you're right. Gaslighting is emotional war disguised as conversation. And the reason God exposes these patterns is because they don't just block your emotional growth, they block your spiritual growth. How can you hear God clearly when your inner voice was trained to doubt itself? How can you trust God's guidance when you were conditioned to believe your instincts are flawed? How can you follow your purpose when someone taught you your desires are selfish? How can you set boundaries when fear of rejection has been drilled into your identity? How can you walk in confidence when shame has been your lifelong companion? Toxic family dynamics don't just affect relationships. They affect destiny. This is why God steps in. This is why He interrupts you with discomfort. This is why He pulls back the curtain. This is why He exposes spiritual realities beneath emotional patterns. because He sees what this is really doing to you. He sees how much you've absorbed. He sees how much you've carried. He sees the emotional labor you were never meant to perform. He sees the childhood wounds you were never allowed to heal. He sees the responsibilities that robbed you of your own identity. He sees the pressure that made you shrink yourself to keep others comfortable. He sees the emotional exhaustion you normalized. He sees the silent tears you hid so others wouldn't feel guilty. He sees the anger you swallowed to avoid conflict. He sees the dreams you lowered to avoid intimidating people. He sees how your self-worth was shaped not by truth, but by survival. And God says, no more. You cannot heal from what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot be free from what you refuse to confront. You cannot break cycles you still excuse. You cannot grow in environments that celebrate your weakness, but fear your strength. You cannot become who He created you to be, while living under emotional systems designed to keep you small. This is why the deeper God takes you in healing, the clearer the patterns become. You start recognizing how certain relatives communicate through anger instead of expression. How they weaponize silence because confrontation would reveal their faults. How they expect maturity from you while behaving immaturely themselves. How they demand respect while refusing to give it. How they expect unconditional support but offer conditional love. How they confuse obedience with loyalty. How they expect you to repair what they intentionally broke. And all of this becomes clearer because God is teaching you to see beyond behavior into spiritual roots. Behind guilt is fear. Behind control is insecurity. Behind manipulation is emotional immaturity. Behind silence is shame. Behind anger is pain. Behind superiority is deep inferiority. Behind domination is a broken inner child. God exposes roots so you stop reacting to symptoms. But here's the challenge. Once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. And the weight of that truth forces a decision. Do you continue pretending everything is fine for the sake of the family image? Or do you honor the truth God has revealed to protect your future? Do you remain emotionally available to people who refuse accountability? Or do you choose peace over performance? Do you allow guilt to intimidate you back into bondage? Or do you walk in the freedom God is awakening inside you? Do you continue the generational cycle? Or do you break it? This is why God's warning feels so heavy, because it requires courage. Courage to face what you've been avoiding. Courage to name what hurt you. Courage to set boundaries where there were none. Courage to release what no longer protects your soul. Courage to disappoint people who depended on your silence. Courage to be misunderstood. Courage to be judged. Courage to walk away from dysfunction. To walk into destiny. And here's the liberating part. God never reveals to embarrass you. He reveals to elevate you. He reveals to free you. He reveals to realign you with truth. He reveals to restore the parts of you that family systems broke. He reveals to rebuild the identity that was shaped by emotional inflation and suppression. He reveals so you can finally breathe without guilt, love without fear, speak without trembling, and become the version of yourself He always intended. There comes a moment in your life when God is no longer just showing you the truth. He's urging you to respond to it, because exposure without action leads you back into the same cycles, the same pain, the same emotional patterns that were slowly draining the life out of you. And God loves you too much to let you stay tied to environments that kill your peace, confuse your identity, and suffocate the purpose He placed inside you. This is why the warnings get louder, why the discomfort grows stronger, why the heaviness becomes unbearable, why the pressure inside you keeps building, why the emotional tolerance you once had is disappearing, why the conversations you used to survive now feel unbearable. Because there comes a point where God is not just revealing, He is calling you out of emotional slavery, calling you out of toxic patterns, calling you out of generational trauma, calling you out of environments that kept you small, calling you out of cycles that made you doubt yourself, calling you out of relationships that demanded your silence, calling you out of family traditions that contradict your healing, calling you out of expectations that violate your identity. And when God calls you out, it's because He's making room for what He wants to call you into. But here's the part many people struggle with. Leaving a toxic environment, especially a toxic family environment, feels like you're betraying something sacred. You've been conditioned your whole life to believe family is everything. You must always be available. Blood is thicker than boundaries. You owe them. You shouldn't need space. You're wrong for wanting distance. You're difficult if you don't comply. You're cruel if you say no. You're ungrateful if you protect yourself. But that is not God speaking, that is generational wound speaking. That is emotional dysfunction speaking. That is fear speaking. That is guilt speaking. That is manipulation passed down like inheritance. And God is breaking that inheritance, because family was never meant to replace God. Family was never meant to be the source of your identity. Family was never meant to be the dictator of your emotions. Family was never meant to control your destiny. Family was never meant to define what you deserve. God is your Father, your identity, your source, your destiny. And when family becomes an idol, when their approval becomes your oxygen, God will shake everything that threatens His place in your life. That shaking hurts, but that shaking is holy. And nothing exposes this holiness more clearly than when God begins drawing a line in your heart saying, "This relationship cannot continue the way it has. This pattern must end. This atmosphere is no longer safe for your soul. This emotional dynamic is destroying you. This person cannot have the same access they used to." And that is when you realize something profound. Distance is not disrespect. Distance is protection. There are some relationships that need space, not because you hate anyone, but because your spirit cannot heal in the same environment that broke it. Healing requires distance, the same way wounds require air. You cannot bind up your emotional injuries while remaining surrounded by the hands that caused them. But understanding this does not make the process easy. The hardest battles are the ones fought within you. The battle between guilt and growth, between obligation and obedience, between comfort and calling, between loyalty and liberation. Because you're not just fighting toxic relatives, you're fighting the internalized beliefs they planted inside you. You're fighting the voice that says, you don't deserve better. You're fighting the voice that says, you're selfish for wanting peace. You're fighting the voice that says, you're abandoning your family. You're fighting the voice that says, you're overreacting. You're fighting the voice that says, you're the problem. You're fighting the voice that says, keep quiet and comply. But those voices are not your own. They are echoes of a wounded system, and God is silencing those echoes. Let's talk about the spiritual difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, because this revelation alone will rewrite your entire understanding of family healing. Forgiveness is one-sided. Reconciliation is two-sided. Forgiveness is internal. Reconciliation requires mutual change. Forgiveness sets your heart free. Reconciliation restores relationship. Forgiveness releases resentment from you. Reconciliation requires repentance from them. Forgiveness happens instantly in your spirit. Reconciliation happens slowly through accountability and behavioral change. You can forgive someone completely and still know they're unsafe, and still know their behavior is unchanged, and still know the relationship cannot return to what it was, and still choose distance as protection, and still love them from afar, and still bless them without letting them break you again. Forgiveness is commanded. Reconciliation is optional and only possible with safety, respect, truth, and reciprocity. But here is the lie toxic families feed you. If you're truly healed, you'll let me treat you the same way again. No, that's not healing. That's self-betrayal. A healed person is not someone who allows old harm to return. A healed person is someone who protects their soul with boundaries. Boundaries are not walls, they are doors. Doors you open intentionally. Doors you close when needed. Doors you control, not others. Boundaries say, I love you, but I will not let you disrespect me. I care about you, but I will not sacrifice my mental health for you. I'm here for you, but not at the expense of my identity. I will help you, but I will not rescue you from consequences. I honor you, but I will not be controlled by you. I forgive you, but I will not allow repeated harm. Boundaries are holy because peace is holy. Boundaries are holy because identity is holy. Boundaries are holy because your heart is holy. Boundaries are holy because your destiny is holy. And God will often expose family toxicity for one purpose: to show you where your boundaries need to be built. Because you weren't taught boundaries, you were taught compliance. You weren't taught emotional safety, you were taught emotional endurance. You weren't taught communication, you were taught silence. You weren't taught self-worth, you were taught self-sacrifice. You weren't taught assertiveness, you were taught fear. So boundaries will feel uncomfortable at first. They will feel wrong. They will feel foreign. They will feel mean. Because trauma taught you that protecting yourself is a sin. But setting boundaries is not rebellion. It is recovery. Recovery from years of shrinking. Recovery from years of walking on eggshells. Recovery from years of compensating for someone else's immaturity. Recovery from years of emotional parentification. Recovery from years of guilt-based obedience. Recovery from years of being punished for having needs. Recovery demands that you reclaim authority over your inner world. And when you begin reclaiming that authority, something transformational happens inside you. Your soul begins to breathe again. Your mind begins to clear. Your emotions begin to stabilize. Your self-respect begins to grow. Your confidence begins to rebuild. Your voice begins to return. Your truth becomes louder. Your identity becomes stronger. You realize you were never hard to love. You were just raised in an environment that did not know how to love you well. You realize you were not too sensitive. You were spiritually perceptive, emotionally intelligent, and deeply intuitive. You realize you were not difficult. You were simply breaking generational expectations. You realize you were not cold. You were finally protecting your peace. You realize you were not disrespectful. You were reclaiming your dignity. You realize you were not acting brand new. You were finally becoming who God designed you to be. And once this realization sinks in, you can no longer settle for the emotional crumbs you grew up with. Because healing expands your capacity. Healing expands your standards. Healing expands your boundaries. Healing expands your understanding of love. Healing expands your discernment for what is safe. Healing expands your ability to see through manipulation, fear, guilt, shame, and emotional chaos. Healing exposes what once felt normal and transforms it into something you refuse to ever tolerate again. And here is the truth that will empower the rest of your journey. You are not responsible for their healing. You are responsible for protecting yours. God is calling you to break patterns, not repeat them. To become whole, not remain wounded. To create a healthier future, not recycle the past. To be the generation that says, "This ends here." There comes a point in your journey when the weight finally shifts. You don't feel it at first. It doesn't arrive with fireworks, and it doesn't announce itself loudly. It comes quietly, like the first breath you take after crying for hours. Like the first sunrise after a long night. Like the first moment you realize you're no longer trying to survive, you're beginning to live. This is the moment God brings you into when He leads you out of toxic family patterns. Not instantly, not magically, but gradually, slowly, like your soul is learning how to breathe again. You start noticing the difference first in your mind. The obsessive spinning thoughts calm. The guilt loses its grip. The fear that once filled your chest begins to fade. You wake up without the same dread. You go to sleep without the same heaviness. Your body begins to relax in ways it never could in environments where you were emotionally unsafe. It's strange when peace becomes your new normal, because for so long, chaos was all you knew. For so long, emotional storms defined your relationships. For so long, you carried burdens that were never yours. For so long, you believed love meant carrying someone else's pain while ignoring your own. And now, for the first time, you are learning what life feels like without emotional chains wrapped around your heart. This is what healing sounds like, not loud inspiration, not dramatic transformation, but the deep, quiet shift inside you when you realize, I'm not the same person I used to be. You no longer apologize for having needs. You no longer shrink to make others comfortable. You no longer silence yourself out of fear. You no longer tolerate disrespect disguised as tradition. You no longer internalize other people's wounds as your responsibility. You no longer twist yourself into shapes that make everyone else happy while breaking your own spirit. You're learning to stand, to speak, to breathe, to choose, to honor yourself, to honor God's calling on your life, to choose peace even when guilt tries to pull you back. And it's beautiful, painful but beautiful, messy but beautiful, liberating but beautiful, because the deepest healing always comes with the deepest truth. You were never meant to stay in the emotional prison you were born into. You were never meant to carry the generational weight that was handed to you. You were never meant to sacrifice your identity for the sake of family comfort. You were never meant to be the emotional anchor of a sinking ship. You were never meant to live your whole life walking on eggshells. You were never meant to be the peacekeeper in a war you didn't start. You were never meant to be the child who felt older than the adults around you. You were never meant to feel guilty for choosing your own sanity. You were meant to live fully, freely, authentically, courageously. And that's why God pulled you out. That's why He warned you. That's why He disrupted your spirit. That's why He broke your tolerance for dysfunction. That's why the old environment became unbearable. That's why the old patterns suddenly felt toxic. That's why the things you used to shrug off suddenly pierced you deeply. That's why your spirit couldn't stay where your soul was slowly dying. Because God was preparing you for freedom. And freedom, real freedom, always begins with truth. But freedom is not just leaving what hurt you. Freedom is learning who you are without the voices that distorted your identity. You begin to see yourself differently, not through the lens of someone else's expectations, not through the lens of guilt or fear or shame, not through the lens of family narratives that never fit you, but through the lens of clarity. You start realizing that your sensitivity was never a weakness. It was your intuition. Your empathy was never a flaw. It was your gift. Your desire for peace was never avoidance. It was discernment. Your boundaries were never rebellion. They were self-respect. Your desire for distance was never coldness. It was protection. Your voice was never too much. They were just uncomfortable with truth. Your ambition was never pride. They just feared what they couldn't control. And little by little, you rise, not in arrogance, but in strength, not in bitterness, but in clarity, not in anger, but in understanding, not in revenge, but in wisdom. You rise because you've learned that saving your soul is not a betrayal, it is obedience. You rise because you've learned that love without boundaries isn't love, it's bondage. You rise because you've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, it means freedom. You rise because you've learned that healing is not a destination, it is a lifestyle. You rise because you've learned that choosing peace is choosing God's voice over chaos. You rise because you've learned that protecting yourself is not selfish, It is sacred. And once your soul rises, everything around you begins to shift. Your relationships change. You no longer gravitate toward people who drain you. You're drawn to people who feel safe, steady, clear, and healthy. You start valuing emotional maturity. You crave honesty, not drama. You crave consistency, not chaos. You crave communication, not manipulation. You crave depth, not theatrics. You crave community that builds, not breaks. And as you step away from dysfunctional environments, God brings new people into your life. People who speak to your healed identity, not your wounded one. People who celebrate your growth instead of resenting it. People who honor your boundaries instead of testing them. People who give love without taking your soul as payment. These new connections are not replacements. They are restorations. They are God's way of showing you how love was always meant to feel. Peaceful, supportive, balanced, respectful, honest, safe. This is the life God is leading you into, a life where love is not painful, where connection is not draining, where belonging doesn't cost you your identity, where relationships help you grow instead of holding you hostage. But the greatest transformation doesn't happen around you, it happens inside you. You begin to reclaim everything that was taken from you through years of emotional turmoil. You reclaim your self-worth. You reclaim your voice. You reclaim your dreams. You reclaim your joy. You reclaim your trust in your own intuition. You reclaim your sense of stability. You reclaim the right to feel, to choose to rest, to be whole. For the first time, you're not living in reaction to someone else's dysfunction. You're living in alignment with who you were always meant to be. And the most powerful part, your healing becomes the beginning of a new legacy. Because toxic families do not simply pass down behaviors, they pass down emotional maps. And when you heal, you rewrite the map. Your future children will not have to recover from the same wounds. Your relationships will not mirror the chaos you survived. Your home will not echo with the emotional storms you grew up in. You become the pivot point, the turning point, the interruption, the one who says, "This ends here. This ends with me, and love will look different after me." Your healing becomes a generational blessing. Your clarity becomes a generational shield. Your boundaries become generational wisdom. Your peace becomes generational inheritance. You are not just healing for yourself, you are healing for everyone who comes after you. This is why the spiritual war was so intense. This is why the emotional pressure felt unbearable. This is why the guilt was so heavy. This is why breaking away felt impossible. This is why the moment you tried to grow, resistance came from every direction. Because you were not just leaving a toxic dynamic, you were breaking a generational cycle. And cycles don't break quietly. They break through confrontation. They break through truth. They break through courage. They break through boundaries. They break through awakening. They break through healing. They break through a decision to value your soul over someone else's comfort. And now, here you are, at the end of the old you, at the beginning of the new you, healed, awake, whole, free, not perfect, but free, not finished, but free, not formed completely, but forming beautifully. You are stepping into a life where love will not demand your silence, where peace will not feel like a luxury, where emotional safety will not feel foreign, where joy will not feel temporary, where your identity is no longer shaped by wounds, where your worth is no longer negotiable, where your heart is no longer a battlefield, where the future feels possible, finally possible. This is the life God was warning you toward. This is the freedom He was pulling you into. This is the identity He was fighting to restore. This is the destiny He refused to let you abandon. This is the healing He always intended for you.